A highly decorated officer wearing countless prestigious medals, the ultimate paradigm of a civilized military machine. Place this image beside a rogue warlord operating deep in the jungle, ruling a fanatical cult surrounded by grim physical warnings. This contrast creates a profound visual shock. He began as the pride of a global superpower. He ended as an unyielding autocrat who discarded every law of human civilization. This is Colonel Walter E. Kurtz. Why did a brilliant soldier who dedicated his entire life to his nation ultimately choose to exile himself into the shadows, mutating into a cold, detached ruler in the untamed wilderness? During his early career, Kurtz was the military apparatus's finest achievement. His internal state relied entirely on external discipline. The rules, the hierarchy, and the geopolitical objectives of his nation formed the very foundation of his psychological stability. He uses this rigid external structure to define his entire sense of self, masking any personal vulnerabilities behind a shield of institutional authority. This deep alignment between his personal ego and his assigned role leaves no room for hesitation. The man and the commander are identical. He operates as a living extension of a heavily fortified bureaucratic machine, leaving his independent thought dormant. The establishment provides him with an impenetrable narrative of moral superiority and righteous purpose. For a man tasked with orchestrating systemic elimination on a grand scale, this narrative is not just useful, it is a vital psychological necessity. This intense identification with the establishment operates as an elite form of self-defense. Kurtz possesses an exceptionally high intellect, a mind capable of dissecting complex philosophies and recognizing the inherent chaos of the human condition. To protect his own sanity from this existential dread, he completely internalizes the core values of his organization. When a brilliant individual submits entirely to a rigid hierarchy, they effectively blind themselves to the glaring hypocrisies embedded within that very structure. The medals and commendations serve as physical proof that his forceful actions are not only justified, but culturally essential. This era of his life represents the absolute pinnacle of what society deems a successful man. The pressure to remain the unwavering pillar of strength is immense, reflecting a specific brand of stoic masculinity expected of leaders during the mid-20th century. He cannot afford to show doubt, for doubt is a luxury that the mechanics of global conflict do not permit. By maintaining this immaculate facade, he inadvertently sets the stage for a catastrophic psychological fracture. The higher the pedestal the institution builds for him, the more devastating the inevitable fall will become. His decision to abandon a comfortable Pentagon position for the grueling Special Forces marks a desperate need to embody the warrior ideal. Rather than rebelling, he dives into the establishment's most concentrated core. By volunteering for airborne training at an advanced age, he seeks to bridge the gap between administrative theory and physical reality. He demands to be tested by the very crucible that the institution uses to forge its most devoted instruments. This action highlights a subtle yet dangerous trait, an obsessive pursuit of purity within a system that is inherently corrupt. He believes that by becoming the ultimate operational weapon, he can bypass the political maneuvering of the rear echelon. He is trying to find a pure, uncompromised version of the mission that simply does not exist. Even in this phase of absolute loyalty, a profound internal contradiction lies dormant within his psyche. his capacity for deep philosophical reflection, is fundamentally at odds with an apparatus designed to execute controlled devastation. The military structure demands unquestioning obedience, yet it has cultivated a mind that is uniquely equipped to question everything. For now, this dangerous paradox is kept entirely in check by his unwavering belief in the righteousness of his nation's cause. He has not yet realized that the framework he serves is held together by diplomatic falsehoods rather than moral truths. The geopolitical landscape provides essential context for his conditioning. The Cold War required commanders to view the world in absolute binaries of good and evil. We see a clear reflection of this rigid worldview in the division of the Korean Peninsula, an era where South Korean historical perspectives often emphasize the devastating civilian toll and the moral ambiguity of superpower interventions. Kurtz initially internalized this absolute binary, operating under the illusion that he was a crusader for civilization. This exact psychological mechanism prevented him from acknowledging the moral gray areas of his assignments. Director Francis Ford Coppola constructs our initial understanding of this man entirely through the remnants of institutional paperwork. We do not meet a living, breathing human being. We are introduced to a ghost assembled from glowing performance reviews and sterile photographs. As Captain Willard flips through the dossier in the claustrophobic shadows of the patrol boat, the audience is presented with a heavily curated myth. The bright, sharp lighting on the photographs creates a deliberate visual contrast against the murky, oppressive atmosphere of the river journey. This cinematic technique isolates the perfect soldier in the past, highlighting the severe disconnect between the man on paper and the reality of the jungle. Willard's voiceover during these early scenes is steeped in an almost hypnotic reverence for the missing commander. He reads the accomplishments of a man who seemingly mastered the chaotic art of command with effortless grace. This narration acts as the voice of the establishment itself, mourning the loss of its most valuable asset. Yet underneath the admiration, there is a distinct clinical detachment in the way the military records his life. The dossier reduces a complex human soul to a mere list of successful operations and administrative milestones. The power dynamics at play during this period of his life are entirely unidirectional. The governing bodies wield absolute authority because they hold the exclusive right to define a man's worth and historical legacy. They provide him with a sense of purpose, wrapping the grim realities of his tactical decisions in the respectable language of national defense. As long as his actions align with their strategic optics, he is protected, celebrated, and elevated. The system essentially rents his intellect and physical endurance, paying him in the currency of prestige and social validation. This transactional relationship forms the fragile bedrock of his entire psychological stability. He assumes that his unwavering loyalty to the chain of command will be reciprocated with unwavering support. It is a fundamental psychological contract where he shoulders the immense burden of orchestrating devastation, and in return, the system absorbs the moral liability. He does not have to bear the spiritual weight of his actions because he is acting strictly under the umbrella of lawful orders. This diffusion of responsibility is what allows highly civilized men to execute unspeakable directives without immediately losing their sanity. However, this state of equilibrium requires the institution to maintain a facade of absolute moral integrity. The moment the establishment displays inconsistency, the psychological contract begins to fracture. Kurtz's high cognitive function ensures that he is always subconsciously monitoring the alignment between stated ideals and actual practices. He is an observer trapped inside the machine, analyzing the gears even as he drives them forward. The tragedy begins because his intelligence will eventually outpace his capacity for blind obedience. The profound isolation accompanying this level of perfection forces him into a deeply lonely psychological space. He cannot confide his intellectual burdens to his subordinates without compromising his authoritative aura. Simultaneously, he cannot reveal any philosophical doubts to his superiors without risking his meticulously constructed career. He is a prisoner of his own excellence, trapped in a cycle of maintaining a flawless image for a hierarchy that only values his utility. This suppressed isolation acts as a slow, corrosive force on his internal stability. The human mind requires authentic connection, yet his position demands a constant performance of stoic detachment. He is forced to process the immense psychological toll of his environment entirely alone. This environment rewards the repression of trauma, viewing emotional resilience not as a process of healing, but as a rigid refusal to break. He is essentially constructing a massive psychological dam, holding back an ocean of unprocessed moral complexity. The danger of relying solely on an external framework for self-validation is a well-documented phenomenon in behavioral analysis. When a person outsources their moral compass to a massive organization, they surrender their most fundamental autonomy. If that organization's compass is artificially manipulated, the individual's entire reality is suddenly rendered invalid. Kurtz's tragedy is firmly rooted in this initial fatal mistake of trusting a political apparatus with the custody of his soul. He gave everything to an entity that views him merely as a line item on a strategic balance sheet. In this early phase, the illusion of the perfect commander remains intact but highly volatile. He stands at the precipice, fully convinced that the armor of institutional validation will protect him from the savage realities of human nature. He believes that the civilized rules of engagement can somehow sanitize the darkest acts of global conflict. He is, tragically, a man defined by a system that is fundamentally unprepared for the raw, primal truth of the environment it seeks to control. The stage is set for a devastating collision between a heavily structured mind and the untamed chaos of a reality that refuses to be governed. The catalyst for destruction is rarely a single enemy ambush or a sudden failure of tactical logistics. For a man so deeply entrenched in the architecture of military obedience, the fracture must come from within the very institution he worships. This phase marks the inception of a severe identity crisis, a profound psychological unraveling triggered by an unforgivable institutional betrayal. He is not merely traumatized by the brutal theater of combat, as many ordinary men are in times of severe conflict. Instead, he suffers a catastrophic moral injury that fundamentally alters his perception of reality. The internal rupture begins with his unauthorized decisive actions against embedded double agents. He recognized a severe tactical vulnerability within the operational theater and moved to neutralize the threat with ruthless, uncompromising efficiency. However, his superiors do not commend this display of initiative. They recoil in bureaucratic horror and threaten severe disciplinary retaliation. They do not object to the elimination of the threat itself, but rather to the fact that he bypassed their sanitized administrative protocols. It is a staggering display of hypocrisy that completely shatters his meticulously constructed ideological framework. This is the exact moment the psychological contract between the soldier and the establishment is irreversibly broken. The high command demands the systemic dismantling of opposing forces, yet they insist on maintaining the fragile illusion of civilized procedure. They expect him to execute extreme definitive measures in the shadows while they comfortably deny any association under the glaring lights of public relations. For a highly analytical mind like his, this contradictory mandate becomes an impossible psychological burden to carry. He realizes that the men orchestrating this massive theater are merely politicians masquerading as moral arbiters. This psychological state differs from standard combat trauma, which typically stems from the overwhelming fear and chaos of physical danger. What Kurtz experiences is a profound moral injury, a specialized form of psychological damage that occurs when an authority figure betrays what is right in a high-stakes environment. His internal architecture was built entirely upon the unwavering belief that his superiors represented a higher, righteous order. When that illusion evaporates, he is left completely unmoored in a landscape defined by absolute moral ambiguity. He suddenly finds himself without a true identity because the institution that defined him is fundamentally corrupt. The cognitive dissonance he endures during this period is nothing short of paralyzing to his brilliant mind. He is forced to reconcile the polished aristocratic traditions of officer training with the primal chaotic reality of jungle survival. The establishment attempts to impose a grid of rational Western logic over an environment that aggressively resists any form of systemic control. He sees the absolute absurdity of fighting a visceral elemental conflict while strictly adhering to a gentleman's rulebook. This realization creates a massive fissure in his psyche, splitting the dutiful commander from the awakening, disillusioned observer. He begins to perceive his own nation's strategy as a weak, contradictory effort, born of immense arrogance and profound denial. They drop fire from the sky but hand out rations, attempting to balance unspeakable devastation with performative acts of charity. This is the very definition of a fragmented morality, an approach that lacks the absolute commitment required to either win the conflict or abandon it entirely. Kurtz's high intelligence processes this hypocrisy not just as a tactical failure, but as a deep spiritual cowardice. He realizes that a highly civilized society is inherently incapable of sustaining the pure, unhesitating resolve necessary for total victory. The profound revelation within his infamous diamond bullet monologue serves as the ultimate catalyst for his philosophical shift. The memory he recounts, the eradication of a village's children by opposing forces simply because they had been inoculated by his medics, shattered his remaining illusions. Witnessing the grim aftermath of the inoculated villagers, he recognized an absolute clarity of purpose that his own civilized army lacked. It was a realization that struck his consciousness with the precision and devastating force of a flawless, impenetrable projectile. He describes the perpetrators of this act not as monsters, but as men of immense will, capable of detaching their human compassion from their tactical objectives. He realizes that they defeated the establishment's technological superiority through an unyielding elemental strength of mind. The establishment views this act as purely savage, but Kurtz begins to view it as a state of tragic, undeniable perfection. He understands that to wage a campaign while holding onto sentimental morality is the true obscenity, a half measure that only prolongs the suffering. He sees the absolute necessity of becoming immune to the paralyzing effects of human empathy. This ideological pivot reveals a fascinating dimension of masculine psychological defense mechanisms operating under extreme duress. Traditionally, his role was the paternal protector, the patriarchal figure delivering civilization and order to the untamed wilderness. However, the diamond bullet shatters this paternalistic illusion, leaving him with a deep sense of generational trauma and profound impotence. He recognizes that his civilized masculinity is a distinct disadvantage against an adversary possessing a purely instinctual, unapologetic drive for survival. To adapt, he must ruthlessly strip away the very core of his learned humanity. His rationalization of extreme measures creates a slippery slope of moral decay, completely justified through pure logic. He no longer views his actions as transgressions, but as harsh necessities born from an environment that demands absolute severity. The establishment betrayed him by refusing to acknowledge the reality of this environment, so he officially revokes his loyalty to their imaginary rules. He transitions from a proactive agent of a global superpower to a cold, detached entity evaluating the fundamental flaws of human civilization. He is a man who has lost his faith and is now furiously searching for new absolute truth in the darkness. Director Francis Ford Coppola masterfully translates this internal collapse through a brilliant shift in cinematic language and auditory design. While we previously knew the man through bright, pristine military photographs, he is now represented almost exclusively through disembodied audio recordings. His voice on the tapes is profoundly different from the crisp, authoritative tone one would expect from a distinguished commanding officer. It is a voice heavy with philosophical exhaustion, carrying a dark, hypnotic cadence that borders on the deeply academic. He sounds less like a general delivering a tactical briefing, and more like a weary philosopher delivering a grim eulogy for human morality. The lighting in the film during these auditory sequences grows progressively darker, mirroring the slow, deliberate extinguishing of his internal light. As the patrol boat moves deeper into the oppressive fog of the river, Willard listens to a man methodically tearing down the ideological scaffolding of his own life. The tape recordings serve as a crucial bridge between the perfect soldier of the past and the enigmatic figure waiting in the shadows. They document the exact frequency of a brilliant mind, systematically detaching itself from the concept of a righteous society. It is the haunting sound of a man carefully studying his own moral dissection. Furthermore, the authorities commanding Willard to listen to these tapes display a chilling level of institutional detachment. They casually label Kurtz as an unsound mind, a dangerous deviation from their acceptable parameters of operation. They completely fail to recognize that his current state is the direct, logical byproduct of their own contradictory directives and hypocritical demands. By branding him as an unstable warlord, the establishment effectively washes its hands of any responsibility for his psychological mutation. They utilize their immense structural power to define him as the ultimate villain, thereby protecting the myth of their own moral purity. This dynamic highlights the sheer, terrifying power of the establishment to dictate reality and destroy individual legacy at a moment's notice. They possess the administrative machinery to elevate a man to the status of a national hero and the equal capacity to erase him entirely. Kurtz understands this machinery intimately, realizing that he was never truly valued as a human being with a distinct, irreplaceable soul. He was a highly calibrated instrument, and the moment he started operating outside of their controlled frequency, he was designated for absolute termination. This realization of his own expendability is the final blow to his fragile connection with the civilized world. As the narrative pushes forward, he is completely stripped of his rank, his honor, and his foundational beliefs. He is a man floating in a profound existential void, burdened by a towering intellect that refuses to let him live in comfortable ignorance. The moral injury he suffered has proven fatal to his former identity, leaving only a hollow shell waiting to be filled by a darker, more absolute philosophy. He has seen the profound weakness of the system, and he refuses to be a victim of its hypocritical theater for another second. The perfect soldier is officially gone, leaving a highly dangerous, disillusioned patriarch ready to step fully into the shadows. Having suffered a complete ideological collapse, Colonel Kurtz does not simply wander into the wilderness as a broken, chaotic man. He makes a deliberate, highly calculated decision to sever every remaining psychological tether to the civilized world. This is not an act of erratic desertion, but a conscious psychological separation from an establishment that has proven entirely fraudulent to his analytical mind. He steps into the oppressive darkness of the jungle not to hide, but to initiate a profound and terrifying process of self-restructuring. He completely discards the moral framework that once dictated his every breath, preparing to build something entirely new from the ashes of his former identity. For decades, the system forced him to repress his primal instincts to appease the sanitized expectations of the military hierarchy. Now he weaves this inherent darkness directly into his core identity. He strips away the performative layers of modern morality, realizing that civilized ethics are merely a luxury afforded by geographical distance from the actual conflict. By discarding the establishment's hypocritical rulebook, he exposes the raw mechanism of survival that governs human history. He is no longer playing a heavily scrutinized role assigned by politicians. He is authoring his own unapologetic reality. What makes this transformation uniquely terrifying is that he does not devolve into a state of feral, unthinking savagery or disorganized madness. His towering intellect remains entirely intact, rendering him far more dangerous than a man who has simply lost his cognitive faculties. He's applying elite academic tactical planning to a deeply primal, uncivilized state of existence. This creates a deeply unsettling paradox, a man enacting extreme, lethal measures with the calm, calculating demeanor of a university professor. He is not a madman acting on blind impulse. He is a meticulous architect methodically designing an empire based on pure, unfiltered dominance. This internal restructuring stems directly from extreme masculine expectations and the crushing burden of the patriarchal protector role. For his entire life, the system demanded he be the unyielding pillar of strength, absorbing the horrors of the world to keep society safe and blissfully ignorant. When he realizes society is utterly unworthy of this sacrifice, he does not abandon the archetype of the patriarch. He merely twists it to serve his new reality. He transitions from a protector of Western democracy to a fierce, unrelenting tribal chieftain who demands absolute submission in exchange for survival. This is the dark, inevitable mutation of a man conditioned from youth to believe he must carry the brutal weight of the world entirely alone. By cutting off all radio contact and ignoring explicit orders to return, Kurtz actively orchestrates his own social and historical erasure. He voluntarily revokes the prestige, the prestigious medals, and the generational legacy that he spent decades meticulously building and defending. In the eyes of the establishment, he instantly ceases to exist as a decorated officer and becomes a highly classified anomaly slated for permanent removal. This total detachment from societal validation requires an immense, almost unfathomable level of psychological endurance and absolute self-reliance. He is willingly walking into a void where no one will ever praise him, validate his actions, or record his final, unvarnished truth. This extreme isolation serves as a necessary, impenetrable defense mechanism against any further institutional betrayal or bureaucratic manipulation. If he has no superiors, no peers, and no remaining connection to the chain of command, he can never be lied to or casually discarded again. He creates a physical and psychological quarantine zone around himself, ensuring that the infection of political hypocrisy cannot reach his new sanctuary. The deep jungle provides the perfect, suffocating barrier between his newfound clarity and the artificial, contradictory world he deliberately left behind. He is insulating his fractured psyche in the only environment harsh and unforgiving enough to match his internal devastation. Cinematically, Marlon Brando's physical introduction perfectly visualizes this deliberate, highly controlled descent into the psychological abyss. He is consistently bathed in heavy, suffocating shadows, his face constantly drifting in and out of the darkness, as if he is merging with the jungle itself. The lighting is sparse, sharp, and entirely unforgiving, highlighting a man who is completely surrendered to the most obscure corners of his own mind. He moves with a slow, deliberate gravity, stripping away any frantic energy or desperate need to justify his existence to the outside observer. The visual composition tells the audience everything they need to know. He has abandoned the light of civilization entirely, finding absolute comfort in the pitch-black truth. His voice perfectly matches this visual transformation, completely shedding the crisp, authoritative bark expected of an American military commander. He speaks in low, rhythmic murmurs, delivering dense philosophical observations with the quiet, unsettling patience of an ascetic monk. This auditory shift reflects a man who no longer needs to project physical dominance because his psychological authority over his environment is absolute and unquestioned. He does not yell to command attention. He whispers, forcing those around him to lean in and absorb the heavy gravity of his bleak revelations. It is the distinct voice of a man who has stopped fighting the relentless current and has instead chosen to become the river itself. In his newly constructed reality, the infliction of extreme violence is no longer a tactical necessity, heavily monitored by anxious public relations officers. It becomes a fundamental, unapologetic tool for establishing absolute order and eliminating the fatal weakness of human hesitation. He views the establishment's reluctance to use ultimate, unrestrained force as a profound moral failure that only serves to needlessly prolong human suffering. By fully committing to the darkest aspects of conflict without a shred of remorse, he believes he is achieving a twisted, terrifying form of ideological purity. He has effectively brainwashed himself into believing that absolute brutality is the only honest response to an inherently brutal and chaotic world. This period marks his definitive slide down the slippery slope of psychological alienation, moving far beyond the reach of conventional empathy. He is no longer analyzing the mechanics of the war. He has allowed the war to entirely consume and rewrite his internal emotional coding. The generational trauma he witnessed, the endless cycles of politically motivated destruction, have hardened his humanity into something cold and utterly unrecognizable. He looks at humanity not with compassion or brotherhood, but with a clinical, almost entomological detachment, studying the fatal flaws of his own species. He has elevated his own consciousness to a point where he views ordinary human morality as a pathetic artificial construct designed solely to comfort the weak. Within this overwhelming darkness, Kurtz suffers from a profound tragic illusion of absolute cognitive clarity. He genuinely believes that by stripping away the hypocrisies of society, he has discovered the ultimate unvarnished truth of human existence. This is a highly common pitfall for profoundly analytical minds undergoing severe trauma. They mistakenly conflate deep cynicism and emotional detachment with true enlightenment. He assumes his new perspective is superior, failing to realize that he has simply traded one form of ideological conditioning for a much darker, self-imposed ideology. His brilliant mind has essentially trapped him in an airtight echo chamber of his own bleak, unforgiving philosophy. His psychological restructuring sharply contrasts with the man sent up the river to eliminate him. Captain Willard is still tenuously tethered to the establishment, still violently struggling with the exact moral dissonance that Kurtz has entirely discarded. As Willard travels further up the river, he is slowly experiencing the very same ideological unraveling that Kurtz underwent years prior. Kurtz has already crossed the dark threshold that Willard is currently staring at with profound dread and undeniable morbid fascination. The rogue commander stands as a dark, unavoidable reflection of what the pursuing assassin is rapidly becoming, representing an inevitable endpoint for any soldier who looks too closely at the truth. Kurtz meticulously orchestrates his own psychological rebirth. The man who wore the crisp, decorated uniform and followed the polite protocols of Washington is dead, systematically dismantled by his own hand. In his place stands a formidable, highly educated warlord who operates entirely outside the boundaries of international law and basic human decency. He is rebuilding his identity from the ground up using the blood, mud, and chaos of the surrounding conflict as his structural foundation. It is a terrifying testament to human adaptability, showing how a highly structured mind can perfectly recalibrate itself to thrive in pure, unadulterated anarchy. Crossing this dark threshold marks the definitive point of no return for his character. There is no rehabilitation, no psychiatric therapy, and no disciplinary action that can retrieve a mind that has walked this far past the edge of the civilized map. He has looked intently at the modern world, weighed its shallow values against the stark reality of survival, and definitively judged it as entirely inadequate. He has not lost his mind to the jungle. He has simply chosen a different, far more terrifying set of rules to govern his ongoing existence. He is fully prepared to bear the immense, crushing weight of his newly forged, fiercely autonomous identity as he prepares to build his kingdom. As he ventures deeper into this unmapped ideological territory, he prepares to transition from a solitary rogue into a figure of absolute, terrifying reverence. He is aggressively gathering the psychological tools necessary to rule a kingdom built on fear, respect, and unfiltered primal energy. He knows with absolute certainty that he can never return to the world of men, so he makes the calculated decision to elevate himself far above them. The darkness has welcomed him completely, providing the exact camouflage he needs to gestate his new devastating persona away from prying eyes. The stage is now set for the former perfect soldier to establish his own empire of unquestioned, absolute authority. Having entirely severed his ties with the establishment, Colonel Kurtz does not simply exist in a vacuum. He actively builds a new paradigm to replace the one that failed him. Deep within the suffocating borders of the jungle, he establishes a sovereign dominion that serves as a physical manifestation of his heavily fortified, paranoid psyche. This is no longer a rogue military outpost maintaining tactical objectives. It is an absolute dominion, a kingdom where his authority is unquestioned. He has transformed the chaotic void of the conflict into a highly structured, visceral theater of his own meticulous design. By controlling every breath and movement within this isolated space, he creates an environment where institutional betrayal is mathematically impossible. His God complex operates not as a symptom of disorganized madness, but as a calculated defense mechanism to prevent his mind from collapsing into the void left by institutional betrayal. He forcefully elevates himself to the ultimate position of structural authority. He becomes the arbiter of fate, ensuring no higher power can ever dictate his worth again. It is a psychological paradox. The betrayed victim mutates into the ultimate oppressor merely to survive his own internal devastation. This phase highlights a profound narcissistic reconstruction of his shattered identity, heavily dependent on external validation of the most extreme kind. He surrounds himself with the Montagnard people, cultivating an atmosphere of fierce, unwavering devotion that borders on terrifying religious fanaticism. However, this is not a benevolent integration into an indigenous culture. It is a dark, calculated exercise in psychological dominance and neo-colonial warlordism. He requires their continuous worship as the foundational mortar to hold his newly fabricated, incredibly fragile identity tightly together. Their daily reverence provides him with the visceral proof that he is no longer an expendable pawn, but an indispensable living deity. The patriarchal dynamics within this isolated, suffocating kingdom of shadows are absolute. For decades, the system trained him to be the ultimate protector, the stoic father figure, shielding civilized society from the encroaching darkness. In the untamed jungle, this archetype aggressively metastasizes into an authoritarian nightmare, where his protection is entirely conditional upon absolute, unquestioning submission. He has internalized the very worst aspects of the hierarchy he once despised, amplifying them into a brutal, unforgiving autocracy with no checks and balances. He demands the total surrender of the self from his followers, stripping away their autonomy to feed his own insatiable need for absolute environmental control. Within this dark dominion, the sterile administrative rules of modern warfare are violently replaced by ancient, deeply visceral rituals. He recognizes that bureaucratic protocols failed to maintain order in the primal wilderness, so he reverts to the most fundamental currency of human history: fear and sacrifice. The grim physical warnings decorating his compound serve as a meticulously designed psychological perimeter, a grotesque language communicating absolute severity to any external force that dares to approach. By elevating extreme measures to a sacred daily ritual, he sanitizes his own actions, in a way the political establishment never truly could. Yet, despite achieving this monumental level of control, a profound and inescapable internal contradiction quietly tears at his heavily fortified mind. His towering intellect never shuts off, meaning he is painfully aware of the profound emptiness at the core of his newly constructed empire. He knows with absolute, terrifying certainty that he is not a god, but merely a deeply traumatized man playing an exhausting performative role. This creates an isolated paranoid tumor within his psyche, a festering realization that he has trapped himself in a psychological prison of his own making. He remains entirely alone at the summit of his isolated kingdom, unable to relate to his worshippers, and permanently disconnected from his intellectual peers. This agonizing duality is perfectly visualized through Marlon Brando's masterfully restrained and intensely minimalistic performance. A lesser interpretation would have portrayed the rogue commander as a manic, cackling tyrant, reveling in the sadistic thrill of absolute power. Instead, Brando plays him with a heavy, suffocating weariness, projecting the dark aura of a man who is crushed by the gravity of his own existence. He moves sluggishly through the shadows, his physical bulk representing the immense, paralyzing weight of the reality he has forced himself to shoulder. There is no joy in his dominance, only a cold, mechanical obligation to maintain the terrifying facade he has meticulously built to keep the darkness at bay. His interactions with those who breach his domain reflect this profound psychological exhaustion and his deeply detached sense of superiority. When he speaks to the manic photojournalist or the captive assassin, he does not engage in a conventional reciprocal conversation. He issues dense, philosophical verdicts from an unreachable elevation, treating them as fascinating but ultimately flawed specimens of a civilization he has long since discarded. His dialogue is stripped of all conventional emotion, delivered in a monotonous, hypnotic rhythm that demands total intellectual submission from the listener. He is relentlessly testing the boundaries of their societal indoctrination, searching the shadows for any sign that they comprehend the massive, undeniable truth he has unearthed. The physical architecture of his compound serves as a stark visual metaphor for the tangled, inescapable labyrinth of his own mind. The ruins are ancient, rapidly decaying, and perpetually shrouded in an oppressive mist, reflecting a psyche that has regressed to humanity's most primal origins. The modern tactical weaponry and communication equipment are casually scattered among towering stone idols, visualizing the violent clash between his civilized intellect and his savage reality. He sits silently in the deepest shadows of this temple, a self-imposed exile dwelling in the darkest, most terrifying corners of human potential. It is a perfectly constructed psychological echo chamber where his own bleak philosophies bounce back at him, entirely unchallenged and endlessly magnified. His God complex is simultaneously his greatest achievement and his fatal flaw. It successfully shielded his fractured mind from the hypocrisy of the military establishment, granting him a temporary, intoxicating illusion of total agency. However, it also completely eradicated his remaining capacity for authentic human connection, leaving him stranded in a void of perpetual, agonizing isolation. To be a self-appointed deity among mortals is to be fundamentally alone, forever unable to share the immense, crushing psychological burden of absolute command. The very defense mechanism that saved his mind from institutional betrayal has slowly mutated into the exact instrument of his own slow, agonizing destruction. The heavy burden he carries is a twisted final inheritance of the patriarchal mandate to conquer, control, and suppress all emotional vulnerability. His entire life was an extensive preparation to lead men into the darkest corners of the world, but he was never provided a map to return to the light. The psychological armor he developed to survive multiple brutal deployments has grown so unimaginably thick that it has permanently fused to his soul, suffocating the man beneath. He stands proudly in the rain as a dark monument to the toxic belief that true strength requires the complete surgical eradication of human frailty. By cutting out his own heart to become a flawless leader, he ensured that he could never truly live again. He is acutely aware that the geopolitical establishment will inevitably send an emissary to permanently silence him, to wipe his embarrassing existence from the historical ledger. Yet instead of aggressively fortifying his outer defenses to prevent this outcome, he seems to invite the approaching storm with a quiet, unsettling patience. His brilliant intellect allows him to see the entire global chessboard, understanding perfectly that his rogue empire is an unsustainable temporary anomaly. He is no longer fighting to expand his kingdom. He is merely holding the line, quietly waiting for the inevitable violent consequence of his radical deviation. This passive anticipation is the clearest indicator that the thrill of absolute power has evaporated, leaving behind only the exhausting mechanics of mere survival. The ultimate tragedy of his current state lies in the terrifying realization that his grand philosophical rebellion only led him back to a different form of tyranny. He sought to forcefully escape a hypocritical system that treated young men as expendable tools, only to build a kingdom where he does the exact same thing to his followers. His grueling philosophical journey, meant to uncover a purer, more honest form of existence, instead revealed the inescapable cyclical nature of human cruelty. He is entirely trapped in the very dynamic he despised, having become the exact unfeeling, absolute authority figure that initially caused his moral fracture. The Empire of Blood provides no answers, no salvation, and no lasting peace. It merely reflects the devastating terminal cost of staring too deeply into the abyss. Having established his absolute dominion, the rogue commander does not find the salvation he desperately sought. Instead, he plunges into a state of profound, inescapable existential exhaustion. Living without the comfortable illusions provided by a civilized society demands a catastrophic psychological toll. He has successfully insulated himself from institutional betrayal, but in doing so, he has trapped his mind in a sterile, joyless vacuum. The heavy crown of absolute authority slowly drains the final reserves of his human endurance. This mental deterioration is fundamentally different from a standard depressive episode or conventional combat fatigue. It is the terrifying consequence of an elevated terminal clarity regarding the human condition. He perceives the dark, mechanical gears of human nature with agonizing perfection, leaving absolutely no room for hope or naive optimism. His brilliant intellect, once his greatest asset, becomes a relentless engine of despair that he simply cannot shut down. He is entirely hollowed out by the constant, unyielding friction of processing an unvarnished reality. He views the termination of his command as a highly logical resolution to his grueling arc, desiring an end not out of sudden remorse, panic, or a fear of consequence. He has completely finished his twisted philosophical thesis on the hypocrisy of modern warfare and human morality. There is simply nothing left for him to analyze, conquer, or dismantle in this physical realm. The crushing weight of the patriarchal protector archetype has ultimately pulverized the man carrying it. For his entire adult life, the system demanded he operate as the infallible father figure, absorbing trauma to shield the ignorant masses. In the jungle, he escalated this toxic expectation, becoming an absolute deity responsible for the visceral survival of an entire feral community. This massive concentration of responsibility, coupled with zero emotional outlet, systematically eradicates his remaining life force. He proved his undeniable strength, but the resulting isolation left him spiritually starved and entirely depleted. His severe physical presentation in these final days perfectly mirrors this internal, hollowed-out state. He appears as a massive, immobile shadow, his breathing heavy and laborious, barely summoning the energy to move through the humid air. The physical vessel is visibly failing to contain the immense, suffocating psychological pressure of his own bleak philosophy. He does not project the vibrant, terrifying energy of a conquering warlord hungry for further expansion. Instead, he projects the cold, stagnant aura of a monument that is slowly crumbling under its own massive weight. When the young operative finally arrives at the compound to carry out the establishment's silent directive, Kurtz makes no effort to fortify his position. He observes the arrival of his impending doom with a grim, unsettling sense of profound relief. He understands perfectly why this emissary was sent, recognizing the familiar hypocritical mechanics of the military hierarchy at work. Rather than launching a defense, he practically invites the approaching storm into the deepest chamber of his sanctuary. He views the incoming operative not as an adversary, but as a desperately needed instrument of permanent release. He detains the young officer not to torture him, but to ensure the visitor fully comprehends the gravity of the impending act. Reciting hollow poetry in the darkness, Kurtz demands his legacy be understood by a peer, refusing the sanitized judgment of the High Command. This is not a traditional confrontation. It is a quiet, philosophical handover of a psychological burden. He aggressively transfers his unvarnished truth into the mind of his reluctant successor. The young officer serves as a grim mirror of the loyal soldier Kurtz once was, while the rogue commander reveals the dark, inevitable destination of the operative's own trajectory. A man of such immense capability does not simply end his own existence to escape the mental anguish. The answer lies within the rigid confines of his meticulously constructed God complex. A self-inflicted departure would fundamentally contradict the divine, authoritative persona he has carefully imposed upon his followers. He requires a ceremonial sacrifice, an act perpetrated by an external force, to validate the inherent brutality of the world he despises. He forces the establishment to reach into the shadows and claim him, forcing them to own the violence they constantly pretend to abhor. The hypocrisy of the system is flawlessly validated in this final highly classified military directive. They dispatch a lone operative deep into the wilderness to quietly erase their own monumental mistake, preserving their pristine public image. Kurtz embraces this grim reality, knowing his demise permanently exposes the fraudulent morality of the bureaucracy that created him. By forcing them to eliminate him outside the bounds of any recognized law, he wins the ideological argument. They prove his ultimate thesis that when pushed to the absolute brink, civilized society will gladly abandon its rules to survive. Director Francis Ford Coppola elevates this elimination from a standard tactical strike to an ancient, necessary cleansing ritual. He heavily intercuts the final approach of the operative with the visceral tribal sacrifice of a massive water buffalo. This brilliant cinematic technique strips away the modern context of the conflict, reducing the act to its most primal, elemental foundation. The termination of his existence is not framed as a triumphant victory for the political establishment. It is presented as a solemn, methodical dismantling of a physical vessel that has simply outlived its earthly utility. The powerful animal outside is struck down at the exact moment the rogue commander is struck down in the shadows. Both are massive, dominant entities brought low by the undeniable collective necessity of the surrounding tribe. Coppola uses this visual parallel to emphasize that the fall of the patriarch is an inevitable cycle of human history. The old authority must be violently removed to allow a new, equally flawed reality to temporarily take its place. The final act in both instances is treated not with malice, but with a cold, terrifying reverence. During the final confrontation, Kurtz offers absolutely no physical resistance. He deliberately drops his defensive posture, willingly offering his imposing form to the instrument of his ultimate release. This deliberate surrender highlights his profound, agonizing desire to escape the endless cycle of conscious thought. He does not flinch or beg for a reprieve, maintaining his stoic, philosophical detachment until his final breath. He accepts the physical pain as a necessary fleeting toll required to exit a reality he can no longer tolerate. As his physical form collapses, he whispers his famous final words, "The horror, the horror." This brief phrase is fundamentally misunderstood if viewed as a plea for divine forgiveness or a realization of guilt. It is a definitive clinical diagnosis of the human condition. He is not apologizing, he is articulating the terrifying truth that there is no inherent guiding morality woven into the universe. The horror represents the realization that mankind is capable of unmitigated cruelty the moment artificial laws are removed. He recognizes that darkness is not an anomaly to be eradicated, but the default state of existence, a primal reality that cannot be sanitized by any political ideology. He whispers these parting words not specifically to the young operative, but out into the endless, indifferent void of the jungle. It serves as the closing argument for his grueling psychological journey, a stark confirmation of his deeply held cynicism. He has stared directly into the chaotic core of existence, and he accepts the surrounding darkness as the only absolute truth. There is no triumphant orchestral swell to romanticize his passing, only the heavy, suffocating silence of an uncaring environment. His brilliance, his trauma, and his massive ego are permanently extinguished in the humid shadows. Paradoxically, this bleak acceptance is the very mechanism that finally grants him his long-sought peace. He no longer has to perform, command, rationalize, or fiercely defend his ideological borders against external judgment. The heavy, relentless machinery of his brilliant mind finally powers down, freed from the agonizing daily task of processing human hypocrisy. The blade does not defeat him. It liberates him from the suffocating prison of his own extreme cognitive clarity. He escapes the impossible expectations of the patriarchal protector, dissolving back into the absolute silence of the earth. The geopolitical establishment will undoubtedly view his elimination as a highly successful mission, a clean sanitization of a rogue element. However, the psychological infection he represents cannot be contained by simply removing his physical body from the operational theater. He has successfully transferred the heavy, corrosive burden of his truth directly into the mind of the man sent to silence him. The system believes it has solved the problem, entirely unaware that the emissary has already absorbed the rogue commander's dark philosophy. Kurtz essentially achieves a twisted form of ideological immortality by poisoning the very instrument sent to destroy him. The absolute tragedy of his dominion is fully realized in the eerie silence that immediately follows his passing. The devoted compound does not rise up in a chaotic frenzy to violently avenge their fallen, supposedly divine leader. They simply drop their weapons and bow quietly to the new authority, proving his deeply held belief about the fickle nature of humanity. His agonizing journey through the moral gray area concludes in pitch-black certainty, leaving behind a haunting legacy. He successfully proved that an unyielding, uncompromising commitment to absolute truth will inevitably destroy the human mind. The perfect soldier did not perish from an enemy ambush, but from a terminal, unmanageable overdose of unvarnished reality. Colonel Kurtz remains a towering warning about the fatal cost of looking past the comforting illusions of civilized society. To see the world exactly as it is, without the protective shield of systemic denial, is to invite the ultimate soul-crushing horror. Colonel Walter E. Kurtz stands as the definitive endpoint of a mind meticulously conditioned, then ultimately discarded by the establishment. Evaluating his trajectory within the broader historical framework of the Cold War reveals a stark reality about the military-industrial complex. The High Command routinely ordered severe operations on a massive scale. Their condemnation of Kurtz stemmed entirely from his refusal to maintain the bureaucratic paperwork and public relations spin that sanitized those directives. He forced the system to confront its unfiltered reflection, exposing the stark reality hidden behind diplomatic protocols. This dynamic serves as a harsh critique of the pressures associated with traditional institutional expectations. For generations, the establishment trained its leaders to act as unyielding pillars, tasking them with maintaining global order while absorbing the psychological toll in complete silence. Kurtz represents the catastrophic failure of this mandate. The human mind is incapable of sustaining infinite moral contradiction. When the pressure breached his limits, his carefully constructed stoicism fractured. His repressed philosophies seeped into the surrounding environment, reshaping it into an unrecognizable, isolated dominion. He justified his extreme deviations as necessary experiments, convincing himself that eradicating human weakness was the only path to clarity. This illustrates the profound danger of the self-appointed visionary. When personal philosophy supersedes basic human preservation, severe actions are reduced to mere data points on a strategic map. His intellect, decoupled from conventional empathy, transformed into a cold mechanical force that demanded absolute compliance. The collateral damage generated by his psychological collapse extended far beyond his personal ruin. His ideological shift created a vortex that pulled indigenous populations and subordinates into his orbit. The psychological contagion permanently altered the operatives sent to intercept him, ensuring his worldview would propagate long after his physical removal. The damage inflicted by the establishment upon one individual was amplified and transmitted to everyone in his radius. Ultimately, the legacy of Colonel Kurtz warns of the limits of psychological endurance in the face of manufactured reality. A system built upon fundamental contradictions will inevitably break the individuals it relies upon for survival. When an establishment demands its protectors operate without a genuine moral compass, it cultivates the exact rogue entity it fears most. His existence remains a permanent, chilling record regarding the fatal cost of systemic denial,